Good evening, wherever you are. My name is Arun Gupta. I am the Vice President and General Manager for Open Ecosystem Team at Intel. You can find us at open.intel.com. We have an excellent podcast as well, which you can find out at open.intel.com/podcast. Happy Friday, first of all. And I'm super happy to have Allan Friedman with me from CISA here. Hi, Alan.
Hey, Aaron. Thanks for inviting me.
Absolutely. What a pleasure. You want to, for the five people in the world that don't know you, do you want to introduce yourself?
You mean other than just saying I'm the SBOM guy? I am, I think my official title is Senior Advisor and Strategist at the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. We're the United States Cybersecurity Agency. I'm a failed professor who got suckered into joining government. And a lot of what I like to think about is what are the things that we in the government can do to help promote a broader secure ecosystem, both in the open side and on the market side.
That's beautiful. So that's the broader charter for CISA. And within that CISA, you are a senior strategic advisor. What does that role mean to be? Like, in specific, what do you do? Talk to us about
Sure.
that.
So I sit in the corner of CISA that broadly focuses on vulnerability management. So I have colleagues who work on helping vulnerability disclosure. I have colleagues who work on promoting and advancing the CVE ecosystem and things like that. I have colleagues who are focused on securing the open source ecosystem. My work is around looking at the power of transparency in the supply chain and in the software assurance world, and sort of again push for these systematic changes that can really take a small investment and turn it into a big impact. So most of my time is spent around the specific question of SBOM or software bill of materials.
Beautiful.
And CISA's mission for SBOM sort of two parts. One is to promote SBOM across the entire software world with a specific interest in, of course, the US government, implementing it inside, and with partner governments around the world. And then the second piece of that vision is to continue to advance and refine the technology side of things. I want to acknowledge that SBOM is not completely matured technology. You know, there's a cliche in cybersecurity of building the plane while flying it, and that's very much where we are. So the shorthand of what I like to describe is we're attempting to change how all software on the planet is made, shared, and sold. Small mission.
Yeah, no, and I think you put it very well, where you said, take a small thing and create a big impact. And I think CISA being operating at the federal government level, everybody wants to do business with the government, and CISA, just by being at that level, can partner with other federal agencies around the world. So it can truly, truly cause that big impact. So I'm really excited about the role that CISA plays. And I hope we can do a lot more to raise awareness around CISA's role, honestly.
Oh, well, thank you. Yeah, the partnership side is a big piece of it. Right, it's a very large government inside the U.S., and we each have our own little areas. But cybersecurity is very much a cross-cutting mission, and so part of that is helping people appreciate it. And sometimes it is even just something as simple as going to our colleagues in the Defense Department or the intelligence community and making sure that they see the bigger picture of what innovation is happening in the open source world or in the commercial world, and sort of integrating that side of things into their efforts.
That's beautiful. Fantastic. Yeah. And I know before we went live, you were talking about a 2 a.m. call where you had to partner all of these global agencies to make sure it's not just the US federal government or US private sector, but it's truly a global mission in that sense.
That's a big part of it, right? Again, we don't really need to say it anymore, but we do need to remember it, which is it is a global internet, and cybersecurity is a global problem, and so we need to actively collaborate. And of course, I have colleagues at CISA who are doing operational collaboration, sharing real-time attack threats. But on the strategic side, this is also really important. So CISA has a secure by design agenda and mission, and we worked very hard to get our partner agencies around the world involved in that. Not just the usual suspects of the UK and Canada, but really reaching out across Europe, across Asia. On the SBOM side of things, I'm really excited. We had 14 other countries join us with their CISA equivalents, and everyone had a chance to say what they are trying to do for SBOM. And one of our goals collectively is to make sure that those visions are aligned. The last thing we want is to have, independent cybersecurity rules that all come from a good intention, but still require diverse conformance and diverse compliance.
Yeah, it's a global problem, requires a global collaboration for sure. So SBOM, that's sort of the topic here, and you are Mr. SBOM in that sense. I'm super excited that you are on the webinar here. I think it started with what, E14028. So tell us the journey of SBOM. Tell us about that executive order, how we got here where we are today.
We're going to go back a little further into the past, and in fact, hey, let's go back to post World War II Japan and the supply chain revolution, sometimes called the Toyota Revolution. It's a famous researcher named Deming who talked about the idea if you pay attention to your supply chain, it has huge benefits for organizational efficiency, for product quality, and industry has sort of captured that idea for a long time. And one of the things that I love is the early days of the DevOps revolution, right? Transforming how we think about software was inspired by heavy industry. Some of those early leaders in DevOps said, let's do what they're doing in aluminum or automotive manufacturing, things like that. And so it was only a matter of time before people started to pay attention to their supply chain. I definitely did not come up with the idea of SBOM. There have been people like Josh Corman and Jeff Williams and many more, and I apologize if I didn't mention you, who've been thinking about it for a number of years. But the first step was to actually create a kernel of a place where everyone could talk about it together, because this wasn't just a DevOps problem. Everyone makes software, and so everyone needed to have it. So the first step is the US government convened an effort to say, we're going to talk about SBOM here. This is back in about 2018, where we started the conversation of saying, what do we mean by SBOM? What's inside the scope? What's outside the scope? This happened at the Department of Commerce at NTIA, but really it had even then the participation of folks at CISA, of folks across the government. And what was remarkable about that effort is it did have voices from the supply side, people who make software, and the demand side. And people who think about high-end, modern enterprise-grade software, but also people from what we might consider legacy industries, energy, medical devices, automotive, right? And putting them all in the same room and saying, let's have a shared vision. As that shared vision started to get developed, started to get more attention, more adoption. There's a growing tool model for it. And I want to also take a quick sidestep into the open source world, because again, this is an area that had already been thinking about this. Anyone who thinks about using open source software is aware that you need to track what open source components you're using, not from a security perspective, but from a licensing perspective. And so that community had already been there. And then we had a number of high-profile supply chain attacks. And for the US government, most notably, it was the attack against the company SolarWinds, which really sort of got everyone's attention to realize, saying, oh, attackers are now not just going through the front door of trying to find vulnerabilities in our software, they're attacking the way that we develop our software. So that led to Executive Order 14028 in 2021, where the White House said, well, the introduction of that is wonderful, right? The introduction of that executive order from the president says the trust we place in our software should be commensurate to the trustworthiness of the software and the transparency of the software. And so that laid a foundation for thinking about software assurance and software supply chain. And that was the first time the US government said everything the US government buys is going to have an SBOM. And that meant this was no longer just a fun idea. This was now something that people were going to have to comply with.
And so SBOM is a software bill of materials. And as you said rightly, the trustworthiness, and it tells you about the trustworthiness and the transparency of the software. So, what would be the real world analogy? Like, I go to Costco and I see that, oh, here is a dish that I'm buying, and this dish has this kind of food elements, this much content that is being used. Is that sort of a real analogy? Give me an analogy so that people in the
Yeah.
software world who have not been thinking about can understand it, grok it better.
Sure. So you're exactly right. The analogy of a list of ingredients is pretty powerful. One, because it would be strange to us today to go out and buy food without a list of ingredients, right? We just sort of expect that to be there. So it hasn't changed anything. It's not overly onerous. It doesn't give away trade secrets. A list of ingredients is a natural way and in fact supports the market. But it also helps us think about the limitations, right? A list of ingredients is just data. By itself, it will not keep someone in my family from having something that they have a strong allergy to. By itself, it won't keep me on my 2024 diet. By itself, it won't enforce a dietary rule of plant-based lifestyle or religious lifestyle. But good luck doing any of those things without that list of ingredients. And then the last piece is that list of ingredients is a public commitment. It's the way of, right, the manufacturer of that piece of candy or that box of chocolates of saying, this is what is in my software, or this is what's in my food. And so now you know that I am using fresh, high quality ingredients, or alternatively, hey, I'm using lots of preservatives, but at least now you know.
Yeah, I think it improves the transparency and the trustworthiness and the public commitment, as you said, that I'm providing you the data, whether you like it or you don't like it, but at least I am being transparent about it. I've done my due diligence. Now, how does that translate? How does the SBOM translate in terms of identifying vulnerabilities, and how does it help us track vulnerabilities?
Right. So we'd like to think about this, and again, the list of analogies, a list of ingredients is a powerful analogy because it's helpful for the person who's making the food, right? They can say, hey, let's make sure we know what we're selling. We can put it into our marketing campaign or things like that. And it's helpful for the consumer at the grocery store, like make sure I want it. And it's also helpful right before serving it, right? If I have guests coming over and I know that someone has a nut allergy, I want to be able to look at that before I eat. And so similarly, when we think about if we map allergen to any source of known badness, right? Vulnerabilities are the most common, but there's a lot of other ones that we can talk through. First, the person making the software should be aware of what they're shipping, what they're committing. And we don't want, right, again, they may not care, but at least we want to give them the option of having that information. Second phase is at time of acquisition, right? If you're choosing to use a piece of open source software, or if you're about to sign a check to put some software on your network, or even if you're about to take your customers' data and use a cloud service, you're going to want to know, is this something that has a lot of known risk in it already? Is there known badness? Again, you may not care. Or maybe you could do other things. So, for example, there's an excellent world-class hospital that today demands an SBOM for medical devices. Having known vulnerabilities in that doesn't necessarily mean that that team isn't going to buy that life-saving device. But what it does mean is the security team is going to do a lot of extra work to put it on, build a separated network, and put a bunch of protections around it. So you've got, it helps the producer, it helps the chooser, and then the operator, right? When the guest comes over and I'm about to serve the food, what does that mean? Well, it means that once the software is running and a new risk comes along, right? The next log4j, and every so often says, hey, Allan, are you sure there's going to be another log4j? Yes, I'm sure there's going to be another log4j. It'll be a little different. It'll have another unique feature that'll mean it's somehow harder, that our plans won't work perfectly. But there's always going to be some new risk. And what we need to do is not be able to say, I'm defended ahead of time, although there are some tools today that sort of make those claims. But it's about helping us respond quickly and at low cost. And this is one of those areas where if I can look across all the software that's on my network or all of the SaaS providers that I'm using and instantly be able to tell, okay, we'll use the log4j example. Hey, these products are all written in C. So there's no SBOM there. There's no log4j there. And these ones are written in Java, but there's no log4j. And now I've suddenly shrunk the space that I have to worry about. And even if I don't have, and we can talk about tooling in a moment, but there's still some things that we can do to make that even more efficient.
That's fantastic, actually. And I think you put it very well that it's not a if, it's a when. The next log4j is bubbling up somewhere. We don't know when it's going to happen. And when it happens, at that point of time, the producer, the chooser, and the operator will have that ability that, okay, I can quickly look at it. What is my blast radius? Is it in a Rust library? Is it in a C library? What kind of library, what kind of language it is? And SBOM will help you raise that visibility, that transparency, that trustworthiness that, okay, you know what? This is a medical device, and if medical device is using a log4j, somehow I need to patch it up because this is life threatening. And not all software is life threatening, but when it is, then you can actually take the measures accordingly.
And the other thing I want to point out is the patch is certainly something that we build in, but that's not the only solution. If you know about the risk, but maybe the person who made the software doesn't exist anymore, or it's an open source piece of software and they're not excited about writing an update, there's still other things you can do if you know about it. So, to be forewarned is to be forearmed.
Yeah, exactly. That is truly the spirit. So help us understand, what really goes in an SBOM. Like, let's say I'm writing a simple hello world. Um, Java is my favorite language. I've grown up as part of the JDK team. I write a simple hello world Java, maybe in Spring Boot. That's my framework, for example, or whatever. And then I say, here is my simple application. What would an SBOM for that look like? How far down the rabbit hole do I go to create that SBOM?
And like everyone who's actually have sort of an actually engineering background, uh, one thing to say, hey, this is the high level vision, but implementing it means that you have to grapple with the fact that there are lots of complexities and there's a huge amount of diversity in the software world. So Java with static dependencies is pretty straightforward. And as you start to wrap things, you want to include that depth. Once you start to put some applications in a container, well, then you sort of have to say, do I want the SBOM of the application or do I want the full container? Because now you have your operating system and other pieces that are in their container. Some places this is pretty straightforward. So, modern languages like Golang, this is a pretty easy concept. Other areas, especially once you start to get into the dynamic dependency space, it does get a little more confusing. Then we have the idea of the life cycle of software. Where am I measuring this, right? Because you could say, I am interested in, potentially starting to use this open source. So, okay, you can look at the source repository. And that's a great starting point because the data is already there. But as we all know, sometimes the compilers do crazy things. There are there are 7 people in the world who understand how GCC actually works. I think one of them works at Intel, so you guys are ahead of things. But compilers, at least from my perspective, are a dark and mysterious art. And depending on your language and depending on your configurations, you may be pulling in newer versions of different versions. And so one of the sort of gold standard models to say, hey, if your build process itself can figure out what's going in, well, then there's a huge advantage because that is ground truth. It's literally what was pulled into the software. You can't compile and build without having static dependencies. But there are 2 other places you can look if you want to know what's in a piece of software. One of them is to say, well, I wasn't there when the software was built, and I don't have access to the source code. Or you can say the company gave me an SBOM, and I want to know if it's true. Maybe I'm worried about them lying to me, or maybe I'm worried about a SolarWinds attack. And so there are a lot of great tools on the market today that use binary analysis to figure out what actually goes into a piece of software. And anyone with a master's in software engineering can write mediocre binary analysis tool. There are a lot of great organizations that have built incredible data sets to support it so they can actually look and figure out, yes, this is what's in it. And even this is how it fits together. And then the last place we can look to figure out what's in a piece of software is you may say, I don't care about the software. I care about what's running. Right? I'm worried about real-time risk. And that includes the things that are dynamically pulled in if I've got just a whole bunch of eval statements that are being used. And this starts to get in what's called a runtime SBOM. And again, in the broader security space, it sort of links to things like XDR, where you're just watching not what's in the software, but what's in memory, and being able to piece together, this is actually what's running in real time. All of them have advantages. All of them have disadvantages, of course. And it's a lot of it. This is where we start to get into the hand wavy. It depends on what risk your organization is worried about.
Yeah, no, I think that's very well put because, more often than not, most likely your applications are more complex than just a simple hello world. And you are pulling in dependencies from all over the place. And as you talked about sort of the container element of it, if you're writing a container, you have like multiple base layers and you build container over container over container, base layer over base layer. How deep the rabbit hole goes and sort of how we create the SBOM and what is sort of the trustworthiness, as we talked about, in that element is always a challenging element. So let's go back to the earlier discussion we were having. Let's say either during build time or run time, you are somehow able to create that SBOM representation. How would SBOM really help you? Like, okay, now you have, let's say, a, a dream, but let's say you have SBOM of everything that you have running on your environment. How does it help you figure out the blast radius if a vulnerability happens? One. And second is, how does it help you patch it up if you were to kind of move forward with that?
It's a great question because as we talked about earlier, an SBOM is just data. And I like to use the analogy of giving a vulnerability a CVE identifier. Giving it that number doesn't fix a damn thing, but it supports automation and it supports a more organized response. And so the easiest step is I have my SBOM data, and I have my list of known badness. Now that could be the CVE feed. Great. All of us use it. It could be a private vulnerability list. Lots of organizations use extra vulnerability information because, well, we can have a whole nother discussion on the challenges of the current vulnerability ecosystem. But it also touches on other things that you're worried about. There's some organizations that care a lot about exactly where, in which political jurisdiction, a piece of software was created. So that could be a list of things that I care about. You could be worrying about support. Is this the latest up-to-date version? I may have an internal policy that says I can't use software that's more than a year out of date. So whatever your list of known badness is, the process of consuming an SBOM is linking that data to the risk that you're worried about and making a determination. And you can make that determination locally, this piece of software. And it's also very helpful for saying across all the software on my network or across all the software in the cloud that my data is exposed to, what's the piece I have to worry about?
That's fantastic. Yeah, because as we were talking about, it creates the transparency. What's running on your system once you have the SBOM, and then you can start mapping it up. As you get the list of vulnerabilities, all you have is a CVE identifier, but then kind of mapping it up. That CVE identifier maps to this particular version in my SBOM of the software, and then you can start figuring it out. And then using, as we talked about, the operator model, that's where you can start. The first step in fixing vulnerability is identifying where the vulnerability exists.
Right.
And that's sort of the process where SBOM helps.
And some people say, well, why doesn't it do this? Why doesn't it do that? And I think that's not how you build a reliable ecosystem, right? The path towards an ecosystem is modularity, is being able to say this part will do this, and then it feeds into other things. Because guess what? People already have, or they should have, other steps. So again, you can say, I want to tie this into my asset management tools and processes. I want to tie this into my vulnerability tools and processes. I want to tie it into my CMDB. Right, there are lots of different steps you can do it, and there are going to be different mitigation paths. Right, if I am an application product security team from a software vendor, or someone who's doing something internally, well, then it just amounts to, let me make sure that what I'm pushing doesn't have a known risk. And I can make sure that I'm doing that. If, on the other hand, I'm a downstream network, a user of software, a user of devices, well, then having that advance notice, I may not have an update yet. So then I can start to take other actions. So I can say, all right, there's a vulnerability here. I don't know if it affects me or not. I don't know if there's an exploit or not. But what I can do is tune my cyber threat intelligence to say, let me know the second there's any information whatsoever that this is being exploited. And you can do things like build a custom kill switch. So there's a lot of other actions you can take depending on where in the software world you are, right? Are you a maker? Are you a chooser? Or are you an operator? And what kind of risks you're facing.
Got it. Fantastic. Super. In an SBOM, we talk about putting like a software in there, like information about the software. So let's say zlib, one example, like a very important critical piece of infrastructure. A lot of companies around the world use it. And let's say in SBOM it says zlib 1.2.3. Does that mean consistent, like, when I'm generating an SBOM and somebody else is generating an SBOM, are those version numbers kind of mean the same thing, or could it mean completely different thing?
You've highlighted one of the embarrassing gaps in the entire software ecosystem. And there's a famous quote that is usually attributed to Carl. Oh my God, I'm blanking his name. Carl, the guy who wrote Netscape. Carl to his friends. And it says there are two hard things in all of computer science: cache invalidation and naming things.
Maybe.
And off by one errors. No, right, naming things is very hard to do at global scale. And I would argue that in the entire history of IT, there have been, we've figured out this exactly once. We've managed to build a robust, distributed, resilient identity system. And the annual budget of ICANN, which runs DNS, is about $100 million. No one's given me that budget yet. Once they do, then we'll try to solve it in a more concrete. CISA just wrote a white paper about the broader issue of software identity, and where we did a pretty rigorous study of the problem. We admired the problem really well, and came to the conclusion that there are no easy fixes. And part of it is we expect many different things from our names, right? So one of them is lookup, which is I need to be able to find it here and use that name over there. Another is replicability. If you and I look at the same thing, can we come up with the same name? And so that means it's an intrinsic identifier. So a hash is an example of an intrinsic identifier. But that's not how we have named things. I wish we had a better solution. There's two notes that give us reason to be optimistic. One of them is that I'm not one of these people who says that AI will solve all of our problems. I'm skeptical that almost all of what's being proposed today, I'm skeptical about, and I think a lot of it is unfortunately snake oil. But we've known how to do fuzzy matching for a long time. And this is one of those areas where we can do a decent amount of context-sensitive work to sort of come up with some educated guesses of potential matches, and often modern tools can help us drill down. So that's one piece, whereas maybe a simple matching algorithm, like the kind of thing that would be used in an open source tool, won't solve it. But if this is a priority, we can start to get some tools with some special sauce. And then the second piece is I think we can start to work on the vulnerability infrastructure to accommodate multiple identifiers. And if you go and you look at the US government's official definition of an SBOM, what are called the NTIA minimum elements that we wrote in 2021, it doesn't say identifier, it says identifiers. So if you have multiple identifiers, we should use them, and that increases our odds of being able to find that match. And so we know that some corners of the ecosystem in the commercial space, they're going to use CPEs, Common Platform Enumeration. We know that the open source world has really started to use a project from Philippe Ombredan called Package URL, Pearls, which takes advantage of the fact that modern package managers already have a local namespace. And so a Perl isn't an identifier, it's a wrapper that uses the existing identity space of a package, because you can't have multiple, in many package managers, you can only have one file with one name.
Yeah, and one of the viewers, Kiara Kerry, hi Kiara, naming problem is real, and you're spot on that. How do we name it? Like when I put a version and a software together, how am I using it in my environment? That means the same in your environment as well. That's a hard problem to solve.
It really is, and it is. I think the rise of SBOM has really shined a spotlight onto the fact that this is something that affects all of us. But it's important to note that it's been around for a while, And a solution is much bigger than SBOM, right? It'll touch on the vulnerability ecosystem. It'll touch on package manager policies. And by the way, CISA is working on with the open source community on helping package managers sort of better define and enforce security policies. And there's something as simple as versioning and versioning rules. You know, we've all seen version 1.2.3a. And the question is 1.2.3a before or after version 1.2.3? And so there's something as simple as trying to get the world to use semantic versioning, but we know that there's still lots of reasons why people aren't going to use that. And so any solution we propose has to at least acknowledge that, one, we can't force these things. Even the US government has limited power to sort of change how people write software, especially in open source. And if we acknowledge that there's going to be that built-in diversity, we need to make sure that the solutions we propose can at least be adjusted to acknowledge the world as it is.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think, to me, it's a technology problem for sure, but it's also about the people as well. That, what do people understand and how do they interpret? So this is always a challenge that's going to be. Now, moving on, we started talking about sort of how vulnerabilities, are, how SBOM really helps with the vulnerability element of it. Now, there is a concept of VEX. Talk about that, and how does SBOM and VEX kind of correlate with each other? What is some of the tooling? What does that landscape look like around that part?
So VEX is the first takeaway is VEX is important. It is related to SBOM, but it is separate from SBOM. Now, always very clear, I did not invent SBOM, right? Been around for a while, smart people have been pushing it. I did invent VEX, and I'm not sure if that's a good thing at the end of the day, but I think it's an important piece. VEX stands for Vulnerability Exploitability Exchange. It's a terrible name. That was a placeholder name that we came up with. And some of you may know the famous line that there's nothing in the world quite so permanent as a temporary government solution. But the link between SBOM and VEX is pretty straightforward, which is I may use a component in my software that has a vulnerability, but the vulnerability doesn't affect the software that I built. And this is where the list of ingredients analogy breaks down. So maybe you can imagine that there's a plant where the root is fine, but the leaves have an allergy. Or, right, the difference between cilantro leaves versus coriander seed. And if you just say, I'm using this plant, well, then people who hate cilantro leaves will say, oh, I don't want to eat this. But you can say, hey, listen, I'm only using coriander seed, so you'll be able to still enjoy my delicious snack. That's so analogy here. So imagine that I'm using OpenSSL version 0.9, but I'm only using the pseudo-random number generator. So you will look at my SBOM and see, oh my God, that's an outdated version of OpenSSL. I'm worried about Heartbleed. Warning lights go off. What we need is a way to communicate that I, as the software producer, am asserting that Heartbleed does not affect my product. So what VEX is, it's a very simple concept. It's a channel of communication. It's just data that binds three properties: a piece of software, a vulnerability identifier, and a status. So it says that this piece of software at its core is or is not affected by this vulnerability. So it is independent of SBOM because this is something that you can imagine could just be useful today. So let's go back to Log4j. Imagine how great it would be if a software product team could easily communicate, we're not affected by this. So for example, there's an open source real-time, there's an open source IoT operating system called Zephyr. And there were a bunch of IoT vulnerabilities that came out back in 2020, 2021. And this community wanted to say, hey, none of these affect our product. Well, if they could do that at machine scale, then anyone who had some tooling, it'd be pretty easy to integrate the tooling so that people could say, okay, we're not worried about that. So it can be separate from SBOM, but it also, I think, is a powerful SBOM enabler. And it's going to make commercial software producers a lot more excited to use SBOM, because now they won't have to keep answering the phone when new vulnerability comes out. I see the vulnerabilities in your product. Well, a good product security team is already going to do that homework. They're already going to have some tooling in place to figure out if they're effective. And so now they can push out that information quickly.
Got it. Because I remember last year there was a zlib vulnerability that was floating around, and I remember we were looking at, say, .NET 6, and .NET 6 uses that zlib vulnerability. But after talking to the vendor, we realized, oh, actually, this zlib vulnerability does not get exploited in the .NET. So the idea would have been that you put that exchange information, really tying in your software, vulnerability identifier, and status, as you said, those three things together in the VEX. And then whatever tool I'm using in for my scanning, that VEX could be part of that information and say, yeah, I mean, I understand you're using an older version of .NET and is tagging you that the vulnerability is available, but bringing VEX into the picture, it can actually truly provide the right status that this is not a vulnerability that you're exploited by.
And again, the devil's in the details. If you want a good time, the next time you're at DEF CON, go and walk up to a group of hackers drinking and say, can you define exploitable? Or can you define not exploitable? Because, right, a lot of people's response to not exploitable is, want to bet? And we learn about this stuff changes over time. So today we may look at it and say, this vulnerability is not exploitable based on the public POC that we have. But 3 weeks from now, someone may come along and essentially same vulnerability, but different way of executing it. We found a direct way here. And so all of a sudden, what was thought of as a built-in mitigation no longer protects against it because someone found a way around that. Yeah. And so SBOM is static, right? This is the software. If the software doesn't change, the SBOM doesn't change. Vulnerability data will change. And that's one of the key ways that we try to understand it, is they're helpful, but VEX is dynamic. And so we can accommodate that and build our processes around it.
Beautiful. And Kiara is asking one more question here, which is spot on. Do you imagine that VEX declarations could be automated?
That is a wonderful dream, and it depends a lot on the software and how complex it is and how sophisticated the team is. So for very simple software, pretty straightforward, especially if you're trying to do things like figure out if the compiler has even put the affected code in the software. So that's something that a tool can definitely we can say definitively, and I can tell my lawyers, yeah, this function isn't in the software. As you get to more nuanced pieces, it gets a little harder to automate. There's some really cool work that's happening to predict exploitability inside software. There's a recently announced DARPA program called eBOS, where they're looking exactly this. Can we automate predictions about whether or not a vulnerability is reachable in a piece of code? Now, at its logical extreme, reachability analysis is homomorphic to the halting problem. So, right, will this code ever be executed is quite similar in a large enough, complex enough code base to will this program ever stop? But the good news, which course, we all know can't do. But the good news is more and more tools are looking at smaller pieces of that problem space and can actually make a picture. So I think we're getting to the point where it is automatable to produce it. What we're trying to do is enable the automation for the communication chain. And indeed, security advisories themselves should be machine readable. And CISA has been promoting something called the Common Security Advisory Framework, CSAF, which is a way of expressing a security advisory in JSON and XML. And you can think of VEX as a security advisory, but it now can be both positive or negative, right? There is a risk or there isn't a risk. And now we can automate the consumption. And that's what we're trying to do.
Beautiful. Yeah. Okay. Thank you for that question, Kiara, once again. Um, um, SBOM, there was an effort that happened within your team where you brought a bunch of folks together and did that effort. Tell us about that.
Sure. So, one thing I love about CISA and also I think the SBOM community is, unlike a lot of more formal cybersecurity efforts, we get to have a little fun. And during COVID lockdown, we had some online meetings that we referred to as sipping bill of materials, where everyone sort of had a virtual drink. And SBOM is just a fun way of saying we're just having a big vision of all of the pieces of this. So at CISA, we try to sort of, one, facilitate targeted discussions around smaller pieces of the ecosystem. So we run working groups or facilitate working groups that the community leads on narrow things, right? How do we talk about data quality for SBOMs? How are we going to share this data? What does SBOM mean for SaaS? Sort of looking at particular things and helping the community advance that. But we also want to create opportunities for people to see the big picture. And so last week on Leap Day, because why not have a little fun? We had, still amazed that people joined for this, a 4-hour-long virtual meeting where we brought all these different perspectives to the table. So not only did we get updates on the smaller problems, but we heard what the German government is doing. We had folks from the Department of Defense explain how they're thinking about this issue, which is quite different, right? All that usually happens over there in the Army and national security world. We had folks from the healthcare sector talk about how they're standing up a way of sharing SBOMs with a trusted third party to help medical device manufacturers provide them, and then hospitals consume them in a way that sort of eases the burden of sharing. We learned about what the open source world is doing. And so really trying to bring this. And we had, I think my staff says that 650 people joined that conversation for at least a little bit of it. So we try to make sure that the community can continue to grow, and that people who understand what's going on, but don't need to be experts of it. So our next meeting is going to be in September. It'll probably have an in-person component. So stay tuned, and Arun, we'd love if you would share this with your audience once we get the date nailed down. It'll hopefully be in Denver. And so that'll be a chance to not just listen, but in-person events, it's always much more easy to roll up our sleeves and build something together, not to mention have all those little side conversations in the coffee breaks.
Those are fantastic, actually. Yeah. And I think September, Denver sounds really exciting. I would absolutely love to spread the word around it, because to me, those conversations that happens in the hallway, in the coffee breaks, is where all the interesting stuff happens. And then the primary event where you get to learn how others are thinking about it is always very inspiring, actually. And one thing that I really love is, how CISA has been playing a really important role, I would say, over the last few years, in truly bringing the industry together, private, public, academia, open source, all of those together, and kind of pushing the envelope on the innovation and the criticality and the urgency for all of these things. So I think that is phenomenal. I would really like to give kudos to everybody in CISA for driving that.
Thank you. And it's been wonderful. We really do have, I'm one tiny part of CISA, but our leadership really has embraced both the vision of it's bananas that we don't know what's in our software, as well as the style of doing it, which is should we not try to sort of define this by ourselves, but we can't. We need that expertise from the software community, and we need the diversity from all the different sectors that participate.
Correct. Let's shift focus here a little bit. Do you think SBOMs have to be public, or should all members of the supply chain post it? And how does it matter whether your software is closed source versus open source?
Sure. Fun question. We get that a lot. And right, you got to the answer at the very end, which is the answer is going to be as diverse as the software world itself. Right. A lot of us, in fact, almost all of us use software where the source is public, the binaries are public, the entire commit history is public, all the comments are public. But a lot of us, even if we're not using it, certainly our lives depend on industrial control systems, where not only is the source and the application not public, but the documentation and the instructions and the setup details are protected by NDAs because we don't want it public. And that's okay, right? Our software world is broad, and the way that we think about supply chain should follow that model. So definitely there are going to be cases, quite a few instances, where the SBOM is not going to be public. Now, here's what we need to accommodate as we plan this out, which is, one, you still need to have it. And two, if you don't want it public, we need to think about how to share it in a protected way. And as we all know, access control is hard, especially if you've got a giant customer base. So today, there are companies that are already sharing their SBOMs. I'll call out Cisco, where today you can go and ask Cisco for an SBOM for any of their products that were made after 2021. But you have to be a customer, and they will point you to the fancy Cisco supply chain website. Now, I was born in 1980, so I'm a huge fan of the music from the 1990s. I love, I was around and a teenager for the original grunge revolution, the ska revolution. The kids today, we should definitely be bringing back music from the 90s. You know what we shouldn't bring back from the 90s? Web portals, right? They simply don't scale. And so, yes, it totally works for the early people in the landscape. But, think about any decent sized enterprise. Think about how many people you're buying software from. This happens a little bit in certain smaller supply chains. So, for example, in the automotive world, right now, the automotive manufacturers, they have the portal. So rather than have it be a supplier-based portal, it's the consumer-based portal. And that works because, right, they already track every single one of their suppliers. But as we move forward, one of the things that we're trying to at least understand better is how we're going to move this data around. And the second, so first piece is let's make sure we have ways of sharing it. CISA is going to be publishing not this is how to do it, but at least some frameworks to think about the language, so that we're all using the same terms and the same concepts, so that if an open source project wants to come along, they can propose it. The second piece is we need to make sure that we're integrating it into the supply chain. So, for example, in the embedded system space, there are proprietary real-time operating systems. We need to make sure that people using those in their supply chain can still share that SBOM data downstream with their customers. So the fact that an SBOM is not public cannot be an obstacle for supply chain transparency for people who need to know. And of course, that gets tricky. How do you do multi-hop access control and things like that? But we need to keep up the pressure. And so one of my exhortations to folks watching is just start asking for SBOMs. And if they won't give you one, ask why not. And if they say, well, we don't know what's in our product, that should be a big red flag.
Yeah, basically go get to the five whys. You want to get to the SBOM, you want to get that, you want to build, and maybe start this way, that I want to build more trust in your software. And one of the elements, the way I build trust, is once I know what's in the software. And that's the transparency that is required, essentially. So absolutely, I totally buy into that idea. We have about 5 minutes. There are a couple of topics I want to touch. Well, first of all, I would love to invite Megan to talk about secure by design on this webinar, because that's a topic that we briefly touched upon it. Can you take about 30 seconds to talk about what is that secure by design framework? And this could be a full webinar by itself. Bye.
I think it should be, because the vision, secure by design is a concept that's been around for a while. And recently, the entire U.S. government, led by the White House and Director Easterly, has really been pushing on the idea that we need to change our assumptions and our paradigms around software. And the analogy that we draw heavily from is from automotive safety, where there was just an assumption at the time that a car accident and an injury from a car accident was just the fault of the driver. And we have that in security today. Did you get breached? Well, it was your fault. Nerd harder. And we need to change that assumption. And so that's really what goes into secure by design, of having the right people responsible for security outcomes. And usually that means the provider of the software. The second piece is radical transparency. We need more information shared. Now, of course, I love the idea of sharing SBOM and supply chain data, but this is about sharing vulnerability data quickly, being able to respond quickly. And then a third key piece is direct leadership engagement, right? As an engineer, it's hard for me to admit this, but at the end of the day, it's people and it's organizations, and that's where change comes from. And then the last piece is at CISA, we talk about secure by design and default. And so a huge part of what we need to shift is to say, why is this stuff built insecurely? And then someone, usually the customer, needs to do things to make it secure. Let's change that equation. And rather than having a hardening guide for big pieces of software, let's have a loosening guide or an interoperability guide that allows you to say, well, if I need this to work with this, this is the bit that I change.
Beautiful.
And yes, we should definitely bring in Bob Lord and Jack Cable and Lauren from my team, who've been driving that issue.
Fantastic. I would love to. Yeah. And I would love those introductions, by the way, to bring these people on and talk in depth about secure by design. And I just got a thumbs up from Niklas. Ask your vendor for an SBOM. So stand up, be bold, ask for it, because that's how you build trust in that. I'm seeing a comment from Katie. Hi, Katie from IDC. She's enjoying the talk. That's wonderful. My God, 1 hour has gone by so fast. I got so many more questions to go. I don't want to touch the topic right now because I know this is a bomb as well. SBOM and AI. What does it mean to have an SBOM with the LLMs explosion everywhere, tuning, training, inferencing, RAG, how the data is available, what weights are being used? Maybe provide like a quick...
the 15-second answer is I love the idea that we're pushing for transparency for ML in general and generative AI in particular, but there's a lot more work to be done. And in particular, we need to bring together the people who understand software transparency and the people who understand what generative AI looks like and have them in the same room to explore these concepts.
Excellent. And I think what you're bringing down back to the element that end of the day is people. People need to talk, transparency people, the Gen AI people, then they talk, then they understand, and the communication happens, and that's when good things come out of it. Super.
Great. Yeah.
Allan, I think I can go on for at least an hour more, but I know we both have time commitments. I really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you very much for the wonderful time.
Thanks everyone for watching, and Aaron, thank you so much for inviting me. This was a lot of fun.
Absolutely. And I'm looking forward to those introductions for the Secure by Design, and we'll roll it from there.
Wonderful.
Thank you so much. Have a wonderful weekend. Bye, everybody.